20th of July, 2016. A press room in Washington. The Attorney General of the United States describes what her department has just filed as the largest single action in the history of its kleptocracy program. The number in the complaint is $4.5 billion, taken from a development fund set up by the government of Malaysia to build things for Malaysians. Now hold on to one thing, because the whole story turns on it. The man the United States government named as the architect of it has never been convicted of anything, anywhere on earth. Almost everything else in that complaint has been proved somewhere, in some court by somebody. Part of the money, the Justice Department says, was spent on a Manhattan penthouse. Part of it on a Monet. Part of it on a $250 million yacht. And part of it paid to make a Hollywood film about a stockbroker who steals from ordinary people and gets away with it. Two questions, and they do not resolve at the same time. The first is mechanical. How does $4.5 billion leave a state fund that has a board, an auditor, a finance ministry above it, and international banks on either side of every transaction? Not stolen from a vault, wired with paperwork through the regulated financial system in public over 6 years. You will see exactly how, and the how is duller and more frightening than any heist. The second question is the one I actually care about. This is one of the most thoroughly documented financial crimes in modern history. There are complaints filed under oath, guilty pleas, jury verdicts, a federal court judgment, and a central bank that shut 2 banks down. So at the end of all that documentation, who is actually in a prison cell, and for how long, and for which money? Keep score as we go, because the final tally is not the one you would guess from the size of the number. Understand what a sovereign development fund is, because the vulnerability is built into the design and it is not a secret. A government wants to build things, power stations, districts, industrial parks, and it does not want to raise taxes to do it. So it creates a company. The company is legally separate from the state, which means its debts are not on the state's balance sheet. But the state guarantees the debt, or lets everyone assume it does, which means the company can borrow at almost the price the government pays. That is the entire trick, and it is a good trick. Cheap money for long projects. Here is the problem hiding inside it. The company borrows like a government, but it is run like a company. It does not answer to Parliament between elections. Its board reports to a chairman, not a chamber. Its auditors are hired by the people they audit. And when it wires $200 million to a joint venture registered somewhere with no public register, the person who has to notice is a compliance officer at a bank who has been told this is a sovereign client. Now add the part that makes it dangerous rather than merely sloppy. A government fund's money looks clean. It has a national name on it. When it arrives at a bank in Switzerland or Singapore or New York, it does not look like drug money or ransom money. It looks like the sovereign wealth of a fast-growing Asian economy, which is exactly the client every private bank on earth is trying to win. So the money is not smuggled past the system. It is welcomed through the front door. And the same guarantee that makes the borrowing cheap is the thing that makes the money worth taking. There is no hero in this story, so let me give you the person who pays for it instead. Somewhere in Malaysia, in 2009, a child is born. In the same year, the government converts a state investment company into a national development fund and puts the prime minister at the head of its advisory board. The child will never hear about it. She will go to government school, use a government clinic, and grow up in a country that in 2009 produces about $200 billion a year and is climbing fast. Here is her connection to this story, and it is not sentimental, it is contractual. In July of 2026, Malaysia's deputy finance minister tells Parliament that the government has now paid 42.5 billion ringgit against 1MDB's total obligations of 51 billion ringgit, and that 8.9 billion ringgit is still outstanding. 5 billion of principal and just over 4 billion of accumulated interest. The final bond matures in 2039. That child will be 30 years old when the last installment on this is paid. She will have had no vote on any of it, and by then almost nobody will remember what it was for. Now the money. Step 1. The fund. 27th of February 2009. A company is incorporated in the Malaysian state of Terengganu as the Terengganu Investment Authority. Within months, the federal government takes it over and renames it One Malaysia Development Berhad. It raises 5 billion ringgit through Islamic medium-term notes, of which about 4.4 billion is net proceeds. The Prime Minister, Najib Razak, chairs its advisory board. Step 2. The bonds. Between 2012 and 2013, Goldman Sachs underwrites 3 bond offerings for 1 MDB, raising roughly $6.5 billion. The Securities and Exchange Commission would later describe Goldman's fees on this work as hundreds of millions of dollars. Extraordinary for bond underwriting, where fees are normally a fraction of 1%. The United States Justice Department's case states that more than $1.6 billion in bribes was paid to Malaysian and Abu Dhabi officials between 2009 and 2014 to obtain and retain that business. Step 3. The transfers. On the 21st and 25th of March 2013, $681 million arrives in the personal bank accounts of the Prime Minister of Malaysia, routed through Falcon Bank in Singapore. 620 million of it is sent back on the 30th of August that year, described as unutilized. Step 4. The spending. This is the part the Justice Department documented asset by asset in complaints filed under oath. A penthouse at Walker Tower in Manhattan, $50.9 million. A penthouse at the Time Warner Center, $30.55 million. A condominium at Park Laurel, $33.5 million. The Viceroy L'Hermitage Hotel in Beverly Hills, $44.8 million. A townhouse in Belgravia, London, $41.8 million. A Monet, St. George Major at dusk, $35 million. A second Monet, $57.5 million. A Van Gogh drawing, $5.5 million. A diamond necklace, $27.3 million. The invoice for which was described in sworn testimony and New York trial by the jeweler who sold it. And the Equanimity, a super yacht, $250 million, 300 feet of it. Step 5. The film. The Justice Department alleges that more than $100 million of 1 MDB money went into Red Granite Pictures, the production company behind 3 films. One of them is The Wolf of Wall Street, a 3-hour Martin Scorsese picture about a man who builds a fortune out of other people's savings, spends it on yachts and parties, and serves 22 months. In March of 2018, Red Granite settles with the Justice Department for $60 million, paid in 3 installments. Nobody at the company is charged. Read that sequence again and notice what is missing from it. There is no safe being cracked. Every step is a wire transfer, a bond prospectus, a purchase contract, an invoice. All of it leaves a paper trail, because all of it went through institutions whose entire function is to create paper trails. Put yourself in it, because the abstraction is doing a lot of work here. You live in Malaysia. Your government has just told Parliament that it has committed 51 billion ringgit to settling the obligations of a fund you never invested in, never voted for, and could not have found on a map of the state's balance sheet. There are about 35.5 million of you. Do the division. That is roughly 1,430 ringgit for every single person in the country. Every pensioner, every newborn, everyone. Not a tax you can see on a payslip. A commitment that sits inside the national budget and quietly displaces something else. A clinic that gets refurbished later, a road resurfaced next cycle, a teacher's post left vacant for a year. And now here is the number that should stay with you. In 2013, the year the largest transfers in this story took place, Malaysia's entire national health spending, every hospital, every clinic, every drug, public and private together, was about $11.5 billion. The $4.5 billion in that complaint is close to 40% of it. Not 40% of a health department's discretionary budget. 40% of everything the country spent to keep 30 million people alive that year. This is the first chart in this video, and I want to use it to stop you from believing something that is not true. This is Malaysian gross public debt as a share of the economy, on the International Monetary Fund's long-run series. In 1997, before the Asian financial crisis, it is 29.6%. The crisis hits, and it climbs. In 2008, it is 39.4%. In 2009, the year the fund is created, it jumps to 50.4%. By 2024, is 70.1%. Now, the honest reading. That jump in 2009 is not 1 MDB. It is the global financial crisis, and every country on this planet has the same step in its chart that year because output fell and spending rose. I'm not going to draw a causal arrow from a scandal to a national debt curve because the data does not support one, and you would be right not to trust me if I did. What the chart is actually for is scale. Malaysia's public debt goes up by about 30 points of national income across these 25 years, driven by crises, by pandemic spending, by ordinary politics. And sitting inside that, unremarked, absorbed, invisible on this line, is 51 billion ringgit of obligations from one company. The scandal is not big enough to bend this curve. That is not a defense of it. That is the most disturbing thing about it. A theft of $4.5 billion can happen to a country of 35 million people and leave no visible mark on the chart that governments are judged by. 26th of January, 2016. 6 months before the Justice Department files anything, Malaysia's own Attorney General, Muhammad Apandi Ali, announces that he has reviewed the $681 million that landed in the Prime Minister's accounts and found no offense. It was, he says, a personal donation from his Saudi royal family, and most of it was returned. Case closed in Malaysia. 6 months later, the United States Department of Justice files a complaint under oath tracing the same money to 1 MDB, laundered through a chain of accounts, including one at Falcon Bank in Singapore, and names the recipient in its filings as Malaysian official one. 2 governments, 2 conclusions, 1 set of bank records. And you do not have to take a side on faith, because you can weigh the 2 documents by what is in them. One is a statement by an attorney general appointed by the man he is clearing, giving no transaction detail. The other is a civil forfeiture complaint filed in a federal court, with account numbers, dates, and transfer chains, which the filer can be sanctioned for getting wrong. Then something happens that almost never happens in stories like this. On the 9th of May, 2018, Malaysians vote the government out for the first time since independence in 1957. The new government reopens everything. The former prime minister is charged. And the thing that made the earlier clearance possible, that the people investigating reported to the man being investigated, stops being true because he is no longer the man in charge. Here is where the accountability actually landed, and it did not land where the money did. Start with the bank. On the 22nd of October, 2020, Goldman Sachs agrees to pay more than $2.9 billion in a coordinated resolution with the United States authorities. At the time, the largest resolution ever under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. The Securities and Exchange Commission's share alone is $606.3 million in disgorgement and a $400 million civil penalty. Goldman Sachs Malaysia, the subsidiary, pleads guilty to 1 count of conspiracy to violate the anti-bribery law. The parent company gets a deferred prosecution agreement, which means it is charged and the charge is suspended. 3 months earlier, on the 24th of July, 2020, Goldman had settled separately with the Malaysian government for $3.9 billion, $2.5 billion in cash, plus a guarantee that Malaysia would recover at least $1.4 billion more from seized assets traceable to those 3 bond deals. Now the individuals. Tim Leissner, the chairman of Goldman's Southeast Asia business, pleads guilty on the 28th of August, 2018, and is ordered to forfeit $43.7 million. He then cooperates with prosecutors for nearly 7 years, and on the 29th of May, 2025, he is sentenced to 2 years in prison. Roger Ng, a managing director who worked under him and did not cooperate, is convicted by a jury on the 8th of April, 2022, and sentenced on the 9th of March, 2023, to 10 years. and the banks that move the money paid too. Singapore's central bank shut BSI Bank's Singapore operation down on the 24th of May, 2016, and fined it 13.3 million Singapore dollars for 41 anti-money laundering breaches, the first time it had closed a bank in 32 years. It ordered Falcon Bank to cease operations in Singapore on the 11th of October that year, with a $4.3 million fine. DBS and UBS were fined too. Notice the pattern in that list. It is real accountability, and it is almost entirely aimed at the intermediaries, the people who were paid to check. 28th of July, 2020. The High Court in Kuala Lumpur convicts Najib Razak on 7 counts. 3 of criminal breach of trust, 3 of money laundering, 1 of abuse of position. He is sentenced to 12 years in prison and fined 210 million ringgit, with 5 more years if the fine goes unpaid. A former prime minister convicted in his own country's courts by his own country's judges. And now read the charge sheet closely, because this is the detail that almost every headline dropped. The 7 counts concern 42 million ringgit, about $10 million, from a company called SRC International, a former subsidiary of 1MDB. Not the 4.5 billion, not the bond issues, not the yacht, not the Monet, not the film. 42 million ringgit, roughly 1/4% of the number the United States put in its complaint. The Court of Appeal upholds it in December of 2021. On the 23rd of August, 2022, the federal court, the highest court in Malaysia, dismisses his final appeal and upholds both the conviction and the sentence. He goes to prison that same day. 12 years. A country that had never removed a governing party until 2018 has now jailed the man who led it. On the day the cell door closes, this looks like the most complete accountability in the history of financial crime. And then, 17 months later, the sentence changes. 2nd of February, 2024. Malaysia's Pardons Board announces that Najib Razak's 12-year sentence has been halved to 6 years, and that his fine has been cut from 210 million ringgit to 50 million. Not overturned. Reduced. The board does not publish its reasoning at the time. On that arithmetic, he is due for release in 2028. Now look at the whole scoreboard, and it is worth saying plainly that some of it is genuine. A former head of government did go to prison, which is rare anywhere. 2 Goldman Sachs bankers were convicted. 1 served after cooperating, 1 got 10 years. 2 banks were shut in Singapore. Malaysia's government said in August of 2025 that it had recovered about 29.7 billion ringgit, roughly $7 billion, in funds linked to 1MDB and SRC. Be careful with that number. It mixes recovered assets with settlement money from Goldman, and it is measured against a different baseline than the Justice Department's $4.5 billion. It is not a clean before and after. But there is one name that has never appeared on a verdict. Low-Take Joe Low, the man the United States Justice Department describes throughout its filings as the organizer of the scheme, has been charged in the United States and charged in Malaysia, and has never been convicted anywhere on earth. He is a fugitive. He is widely reported to be in China. In July of 2025, a team of investigative journalists reported that he had been living under a forged Australian identity. The Malaysian government said it had received no information confirming it, and I will not present that claim to you as established because one investigative team is one source. What is established and is in every court file? The man at the center of the largest kleptocracy action the United States has ever brought has never stood trial and set the whole scoreboard against one line. This is what Malaysia spends on health in a year. Every hospital, every clinic, every drug, public and private together in US dollars. 2.6 billion in 2000, 6.9 billion in 2009, the year the fund was created. 11.5 billion in 2013. 15.8 billion in 2023. The $4.5 billion in that complaint is 39% of the 2013 line. Goldman's $2.9 billion was paid to the United States. Malaysia's own settlement with the bank was separate and larger. But the ringgit that went out of the fund did not come back as a hospital. So the two questions: how does $4.5 billion leave a state fund? It does not get stolen. It gets structured. A company that borrows like a government and reports like a company. A guarantee that makes the money cheap and therefore worth taking. Auditors hired by the audited. And a chain of private banks for whom a sovereign client is not a red flag but a sales target. Every single step of it generates a document, and the documents are exactly why we know all of this. And who is in a cell? Two investment bankers, one of whom cooperated for 7 years to get two. A former prime minister convicted over 42 million ringgit, a quarter of 1% of the headline number, whose 12 years became 6. Two banks closed. One production company, $60 million, no charges. And the man named in the filings as the architect never tried. Malaysia will keep paying until 2039. Here is the thing I keep coming back to. This is not a story about a system that failed to detect a crime. Everything was detected. It is a story about a system that detected everything, documented everything, proved most of it, and then distributed the consequences almost in inverse proportion to the money. So tell me what you actually think, because reasonable people split on this. Is a conviction over 1/4% of the money real accountability, or is it the cheapest possible way for a system to be able to say that justice was done?